Dear me, we're having trouble with this again. But such is life. Okay, here we go. All right, we're on. Happy Friday. I hope you guys are excited about the upcoming weekend. I honestly have so much to do that the weekend is not much of a weekend, but I'm still excited. It's coming. So today I wanted to continue our discussion on corporate integrity and the application of the framework to a corporate situation. So before I talked about that, the application of that in the realm of um, our creations. Today I want to talk about the deal. The deal is really, it's probably the most important element. Hey, Mateus, it's probably the most important element when we are talking about corporate integrity as far as how it really plays out in the lives of the employees and the CEO and your vendors and your customers and everybody, right? I mean, that ring is the core of our relationships. And what is business except relationships? Okay, any kind of interaction that we have like that, they're all relationships: employer, employee, vendor, and purchaser, customer, and service provider. It's all the relationships. So the 5 elements that make up any good exchange, right? Because anytime you have a relationship, that is actually an exchange. You are exchanging something, a service for money, money for a product, work for payment, right? It's all exchanges. All of the transactions are everything that happens in our society is built on this principle, okay? That there are property rights that people have ownership of, whether it's their own bodies, the services they provide, and there is some kind of exchange happening. So contract law is the law that governs this exchange on the legal side. And back when we learned about what are the elements of a contract, the elements of equity, they are one, all contracts have to have these 5 elements. If they don't have one of these 5 elements, that contract is not enforceable. Why? Because the people understand, the judge, whatever, any reasonable person understands that when if one of those 5 elements is missing, it would be a violation of someone to enforce that contract. It would be a violation of their rights, of their property rights. It would be unequitable. So that is why we have 5 principles. And when you're in a disagreement over a contract, the first thing the judge looks at is, were these 5 elements involved in the contract? Were they all fulfilled so that we even have an enforceable contract to talk about in the first place? And so anytime, we're not just talking about actual contracts, though, we're talking about all relationships, because all relationships are some form of an exchange. Even personal and emotional relationships involve an exchange, right? So if I make dinner for my sweetie, then he is going to say thank you, or he might do something nice for me. It may not happen in that moment, but there's a constant back and forth of giving and exchange in any good and healthy relationship. So when we look at this perspective from the employer side, right? If you're the CEO of the company, then what are you doing? You are paying somebody to provide service. That's what the exchange is. And so the terms of that contract have to be very clear. Same is true when we're talking about providing service to a client, right? So this is why when I'm talking with my clients who are entrepreneurs, I'm like, you got to have those contracts in place. You need to have your client contract so the customer knows exactly what are the terms, what you're providing, what you're not providing, what is the time frame you're providing it in. They all need to be spelled out so that everybody in this is crystal clear on what's happening. And that is the key to avoiding probably 90% of the disagreements and the lawsuits and everything else that happens. People are not clear about the terms. And that is the very first principle of contract, right? That you need to be clear. You need to have a clear object of the exchange. Now, in contract law, they don't say you have to be clear about all the terms exactly, but the clearer you are, the better you can enforce it. And if you weren't clear on something, you may not be able to enforce it, basically. So anything you want to have enforceable, you need to be really clear on and spell it out exactly, which is why contracts end up getting to be these huge, long things, because the lawyers are like, I'm going to spell every single thing out, right? Because they've had so many opportunities to litigate this and see what it is. So we start with the clear terms, right? The clear object of exchange. We have to understand what is being exchanged and what are those terms. The next element is acceptance. So if I give you an employment contract, you read the terms, you say, okay, I'm going to do this, this, and this. You're going to pay me this much. I accept. I accept that. Okay. The same thing when we're talking about when you go to the store and you're shopping, right? You're like, okay, I want this papaya. Here's my money, right? There's an offer. The offer is inherent because the shop has put it up there and offered the items for sale, right? And you accept the offer by picking up the item and handing them money. You're accepting the offer. Now, what's in the element in there is the exchange. I have given money for something. In an employment contract, I'm paying you to do work for me, right? And so that is the exchange. If there might be other types of exchanges that are not so clearly articulated, right? Or oftentimes we get into trouble because we don't articulate things we want from, like we may tell our employee, you need to do this, this, and this, but we may not say, hey, I want you to show up and be enthusiastic, and I want you to take initiative. And when you finish one project, I want you to come to me and ask me for the next one. And you need to make sure you show up on time, and you need to be dressed professionally. We don't always spell those out in the employment contract, right? Sometimes they might be in the employee handbook, which is another element or addendum to that contract, really is what it is, right? So when you're having an exchange or an agreement, it's so important to be clear about what the expectations are. We always run into trouble when we're not clear on our expectations of this. That is the main thing. The next element is there has to be exchange of value. So we talked about that, right? And then you have to have the mental capacity to understand what you're doing. What does this mean? It means that we can't have people who are too young. So children cannot enter into enforceable contracts, or people who are mentally incapacitated, or maybe have dementia, or other things like that, right? Because they cannot hold the consequences of that contract within their mind and fully understand it. So we cannot hold them responsible or accountable for that. And the fifth element is no undue pressure. Now, this is where we see violations all the time. We see it happening in families. We see it happening in like coercive religious groups or cults. We see it happening in our government. We see it happening everywhere, where people are applying undue pressure. What does that mean? It means applying negative pressure to get you to do something you would not otherwise do. You don't want to do it. Okay. This happens in sexual harassment cases, right? Where the sexual harasser might be the boss, and the woman feels pressured. She's like, well, if I don't do this thing he wants me to do, I'm going to lose my job. Okay. And of course, that is not an explicit part of the terms of her job, nor should it ever be. But she feels pressure, undue pressure, under the threat of losing her job. See? But this happens like in many other ways, right? In many other ways. Sometimes people feel pressured to do things that are unethical, that they don't believe in, because otherwise they're going to lose their job, right? They might feel pressured to take actions that they disagree with. Otherwise, they will lose their job. And so it can be a really overt element, like straight up blackmail. Okay. That's a breach of this element is blackmail, but it can also be a lot more subtle, right? It can be a lot more subtle in our relationships, where people are using guilt or peer pressure or lies, telling lies, which would fall under the realm of fraud, right? Telling you a lie to get you to make a choice to do something, telling you something is safe when it's not really that safe, right? Or telling you that this thing has this value or this worth that it doesn't have. Those are lies that come into that element. So all of this comes in to this realm. So how do we look at this when we're talking about things? What are some typical issues that come up regarding corporate integrity in companies that have to do with this ring? I would love to get your input on that. But for instance, some of the ones that I can think of would be, so say an FTC violation. What that is like a false advertising violation. If I go out and say, my product, these health pills can heal, they heal cancer and HIV and everything, right? Like the snake oil salesman. You go out and you say, hey, my product can do all this stuff. It can heal all these things. And it can't, okay? If it can't, that's false advertising, right? So we have a lot of laws around false advertising where we're saying you cannot say this product can do this thing when it can't, because that is a violation of this agreement, right? Because I'm making an offer, but the offer is not true. So if somebody accepts the offer, then they've paid me under false pretenses. So we don't allow that. That's why we have FTC laws, which are supposed to stop that. Not that they do really, but how the government applies that stuff is a whole other realm. But the underlying concept is correct. It's just the application that often gets wrong. But that's something to really be aware of. So when you're talking to your advertising department, you have to make sure they're very, very clear. You don't want to state anything in your advertising that you know is untrue or that you know is not verifiable in some way. See? So because that would fall under false advertising in that exchange. What's another thing that comes up? When employees are struggling when you're struggling with your employees, right? Employee behavior, being on time, other types of stuff like that, usually comes down to this. It comes down to something is messed up in the exchange, okay? Somewhere, there's some expectation that's not clear, or they don't feel like that what the money they're being paid is worth that, right? So there's something that is off. There's an imbalance somehow in the exchange when we're having trouble with employee showing up, right? Absences, sick, taking too much sick leave, all this kind of stuff, right? Or taking undeserved sick leave, right? When they're not sick, which can be a big problem in companies and people lose a lot. So, are we properly incentivizing them? That's what the CEO has to look at. Have we been really clear with our expectations on that? You see? So there's lots of other things we can get into. There's lots of other levels of issues that can come up at work when we're talking about this level of the exchange, because everything about business is exactly this. Everything in business is an exchange, right? It's all an exchange of something of value to get money. That's business at its essence. So these principles are the underlying principles that run the whole ship, whatever that may be in any relationship. So it pays to understand these principles and to look at each level and say, if there's a problem, if there's something going on, which one of these principles is being violated? If I'm having an issue with my employees, if I'm having an issue with my vendors, if I'm having an issue in my advertising, whatever that may be, look at these and say, which one of these principles are we perhaps not fulfilling in the best way that we can? And that will give you a clue as to where the root of the problem is. It's another lens to take a look at and see that problem, see where it may be coming from. Okay? So that's what we're going to talk about for today. I hope you guys have an amazing day. Enjoy and get to the weekend. Get everything wrapped up in time. All right? You guys have a beautiful day. Bye.